Having been in development for well over a decade, Kenshi has gone through many different versions over the years. Some older builds of the game are almost unrecognizable from the Kenshi we know today, with locations and items that have long since been removed. However, much of this unused content still exists within the game's files and can be accessed using the Forgotten Construction Set, or FCS. The FCS is Kenshi's built-in modding tool, using which I was able to find a number of hidden characters that are normally inaccessible in regular gameplay. The first cut character I found is General Screamer the True. The General is a Mark II Screamer skeleton with 80s in all combat stats and a Naginata katana forged by Cross, the highest tier weapon maker in the game. Given the stats and possession of a Meito weapon, it seems that the General was meant to be an endgame boss, likely one of Catlon's subordinates found in the Ash Domes. Perhaps General Screamer was once intended to have command over the squad of Screamer units located in Ash Dome 2. However, as it is right now, that role is currently occupied by the Rhinobot. Another possible connection General Screamer shares is with Screamer the False, a bounty found in the Venge region. The two Screamers share many characteristics, such as their heads, weapons, and armor. However, while the name and similar equipment suggest that the false Screamer is imitating the true, there are some key differences between the two. Firstly, the former wields a heavy polearm, while the latter uses the regularly unobtainable Naginata katana. Second, General Screamer has a unique coloration to his armor, which is missing from the false version. Finally, the true Screamer uses the model for a Mark II skeleton, while the false one uses the Mark I model. Unfortunately, looking through Screamer the False's dialogue tree and bounty reveals no mention of the removed General. It seems that whatever connection the two skeletons once had has since been erased from the game. Following in the theme of generals is Lord Commander Epson. Despite his middling stats, Epson would have commanded a fearsome army of 20 to 100 samurai heavies. Presumably, he would have served a function similar to Igor, leading a base assault on any player brave enough to kidnap a United Cities noble. The Lord Commander's most unique feature is that he is the only character in the game specifically coded to carry a Truth 2 weapon. Truth 2 is a removed weapons manufacturer that was between the Skeleton Smiths and Edgewalkers in quality. Although it has no other special qualities, it gives us a good idea of when in development Epson was created. Perhaps he was a developmental precursor to Igor, with a focus on quantity of troops over quality. Moving on, I was also able to find a couple of animals that were cut from the game. Firstly, we have the Dead Pack Beast, which disappointingly appears to be nothing more than a Garu with its animations removed. With only the name to go off of, it's hard to say what purpose this animal would have served. The second unused animal I found was the Cage Beast. As the name implies, this animal was likely planned to be able to carry prisoner cages, similar to the way other pack animals carry backpacks. Unfortunately, while modders have restored some of this functionality to the game, it appears that the ability to equip pack gear is still absent from vanilla. Aside from missing its cages, this animal is surprisingly complete, with it having animations for walking and attacking. Seeing this, it's a bit sad that the beasts were ultimately cut from the game, seeing how much work was clearly put into them. Next up, we have the Canyonlands Killer, a removed bounty whose wanted poster can still be found in the game. It describes him as an attractive, dark-skinned, bulky Scorchlander who lures and kills his victims. The Canyonlands Killer is actually one of 3 missing characters with wanted posters still in the game, along with the Butcher of Black Scratch and 4 Teeth Milton. However, after searching the FCS for the latter 2, I was unable to find any signs of their existence in the game's files. True to his bounty, the Canyonlands Killer will attempt to lure the player by asking them for help saving his injured daughter. However, upon speaking to him up close, he will then threaten to remove your gullet before attacking. In addition to this, he would have had unique dialogue for being attacked and for being stolen from. Looking at the killer himself, he has stats in the high 30s and wields a spiked club. Based on his name and the mention of an eastern trade route in his bounty, he likely would have been found somewhere close to the United Cities, possibly within the region known as Spine Canyon. In addition to the characters intended to be used as NPCs, there were many unused characters whose apparent purpose was to be played as for testing. Most of these are generic placeholders such as character, character 5337, and character --. However, among these test characters, a few stood out to me as particularly interesting. The first of these is Super Player, a Greenlander with 80s in combat stats. Aside from their fragment axe being too heavy, Super Player mostly lives up to the name and would likely be used for testing fights against endgame enemies. Next, I stumbled onto a trio of characters named Sir Testalot, Sir Shootalot, and Sir Shootabit. Testalot has 100 in all combat stats and wields a Meito Foreign Saber, which happens to be the same weapon as the Bugmaster. So Shootalot and Shootabit are, as their names imply, crossbow users with 60s and 25s in their range stats, respectively. Other than their names, though, there isn't too much that sets these characters apart from the rest. Last from the test characters is the simply named Experienced Man. Perhaps as a result of his experience, he has 200 strength, dexterity, toughness, and attack, with 300 defense and weapon stats. In spite of this, he is only equipped with a rusted fragment axe and wakizashi, severely limiting his damage output. However, dropping the weapons in favor of his fists, the Experienced Man becomes far more deadly. It's hard to say why a character this strong was needed for testing, but it's funny to think that the strongest character in Kenshi isn't Catlon or Tin Fist, but instead a simple man with a bit of experience. The final and most interesting character I'll cover in this video is the Immortal King. The King is a Greenlander equipped with a Meito heavy jit, who would have ruled over a location called the Forgotten Throne. The Kenshi Wiki has a short page on the Immortal King, which states that he may have been an early development version of the character that would eventually become Catlon. Evidence from the FCS supports this, such as the King having a very similar AI package to Catlon, and the fact that he is considered a part of the Second Empire, similar to Catlon's faction, which is the Second Empire Exiles. The most unusual part about the Immortal King is that, unlike other hidden NPCs, he has a fully fleshed out dialogue tree, which appears to tie into the larger Kenshi lore. I wasn't able to get him to legitimately spawn in-game, but I attempted to recreate what an encounter with him would have looked like. Speaking to him reveals 4 dialogue options, all of which result in a confrontation with the King. Assuming that he was indeed a precursor to Catlon, we get a picture of how different the Second Empire was during this stage of development. Most notably, the Immortal King is a Greenlander, in contrast to how Catlon and all of his commanders are skeletons. This could indicate that the ruling class of the Second Empire was once meant to be human rather than skeleton. Another difference between the two is that Catlon is guarded by his 4 commanders and army of 120 storm thralls, whereas the King's dialogue indicates that he would have been fought alone. Finally, in his dialogue, Catlon attributes the fall of his empire to traitors sympathizing with the humans, whereas the King states that his people were slain by outside invaders. Given that we don't know any other civilizations that existed during the Second Empire, we can only wonder as to who these invaders were meant to be, While the evidence from the FCS links the Immortal King to Catlon, the King also shares some similarities with a different character, the Bugmaster. The most obvious of these is that they're both Greenlanders. In addition, both of their respective locations are referred to as thrones. Both the Immortal King's name and the Bugmaster's bounty indicate that they are especially long-lived and somehow connected to the history of Kenshi. And finally, party dialogue describes the Bugmaster as the sole living survivor of the ancient race, which could line up with how the king is apparently the last remnant of his people. Now, this is not to say that the Bugmaster is the Immortal King, but perhaps, like Catlon, parts of the Scrapped King's character were adapted into what we now know as the Bugmaster. The line about being the last member of the ancient race definitely can't be taken at face value, given that the next part of the dialogue is verifiably false. However, it does open up one alternative theory as to who the Immortal King once was. The Lost Ancients books describe the presence of two ancient civilizations, one organic and one skeleton, which coexisted at one point in Kenshi's history. One author goes as far as to suggest that the skeleton civilization warred with and eventually wiped out the organics. Furthermore, the Mystery of Skeletic book explicitly links skeletons to the destruction of the ancient empire. With this in mind, a plausible, if somewhat far-fetched theory is that the Immortal King was intended to be the ruler of this ancient human civilization, rather than the Second Empire itself. Of course, with so little to go off of, these theories should be taken with a grain of salt. Regardless, it's still interesting to guess what the Immortal King's role could have been and what connections he had to other characters before he was ultimately removed from the game. I'll leave you with one final note. The second Lost Ancients book cites the war with the skeletons as the possible origin of certain Okranite texts. While the author doesn't elaborate, it's fun to think that some of the Immortal King's character may have seeped into Holy Nation mythos and inspired the legend of the undying Holy Lord Phoenix. Even after hours of scrolling through character lists and combing through wiki pages, I've only just scratched the surface of what the hidden content of Kenshi has to offer. If you have any interest in this sort of thing, I encourage you to look up a guide to using the FCS to see what interesting things you can find. I spent a lot of time researching for this video, so if you enjoyed it and want to see more like it, I would appreciate if you left a like or comment down below. Anyways, that's the end of the video. Thanks for watching.